So spring training rolls on and the injuries continue to pile up for the Mets. The big news this morning, Sean Manaea is set to miss a couple of weeks with an oblique strain, and that just coming one day after backup utility infielder Nick Madrigal suffered a shoulder injury, potentially opening the door for a fan favorite return. So lots to get into today. But before we do that, today is February 24th, which means that we are 31 days away from opening day. And you know who that player that we're going to feature today. It is Mike Piazza, the greatest hitting catcher of all time. Spent 7.5 seasons with the New York Mets, coming over in a trade with the Marlins in the middle of the 1998 season. Piazza was a 6-time All-Star with the Orange and Blue, clubbing 220 homers and driving in 655 runs over that time. One of the most feared sluggers of his era, Piazza also had a penchant for delivering in the biggest of moments. 1999, Game 6 of the NLCS, a game-tying home run off of John Schmaltz. And then just 2 years later, post 9/11, the Mets' first game in New York City after the horrific attacks, a game-winning home run off of the Braves. He is immortalized in New York Mets history in 2016, becoming just the second member of the Pro Baseball Hall of Fame to don a Mets cap, joining Tom Seaver. Piazza deserves so much more recognition, but there are so many important things that we have to talk about today regarding the current club. And the biggest of news coming out this morning that, according to Mike Puma, Sean Manaea suffered an oblique strain and is set to miss several weeks. Manaea is likely to start the season on the injured list. According to Anthony DiComo, he reported that Manaea has felt discomfort in his right side beginning in the early days of camp. DiComo gave a more specific timeline. He says the Mets are planning to shut the lefty down for 2 weeks before restarting his spring progression. So best case scenario, we're looking at a return for Manaea mid to late April, and maybe he only misses a couple of starts. Manaea was a candidate to start on opening day, but more importantly, he was likely to be relied on as an anchor in this rotation, one that's filled with question marks to begin with and now only gets thinner. Frankie Montas goes down last week with a lat strain. He's shut down for 6 to 8 weeks from even throwing a baseball, so he'll have to go through an entire pitching program before he even begins ramping up and making rehab starts. Best case scenario, in my opinion, we probably don't see him until the All-Star break. So if you look at the Mets rotation right now, it's Kodai Senga, David Peterson, Clay Holmes, and then for the final two spots, a mix of Paul Blackburn, Griffin Canning, and Tylor Megill. Not exactly a all-star worthy rotation there. And I'm very concerned. The Mets have dipped into their depth way more than I think they could have anticipated this early into camp. Look, don't get me wrong. I like Kodai Senga. I think they had visions of him being a quasi-ace for this team, but we also have to be real about it. He's not been the beacon of health in his first 2 years coming over from Japan. He's now on the wrong side of 30. He only made one start in the regular season last year, whether you want to call it a freak injury or not, when he hurt his ankle coming off the mound. But one of the other big questions about Senga when he first came over in 2023 was how well he would adapt to pitching in a 5-man rotation. And to this point, he hasn't done it a whole lot. Clay Holmes may have looked solid in his first spring training start, 3 perfect innings on Saturday, but that doesn't mean there aren't still big questions about how he will adapt to being a starting pitcher over a full season. And then you have David Peterson, who was great last year, a huge boon for the Mets down the stretch, but a guy that's had a lot of health and a lot of consistency issues since he first came up in 2020. Are we totally sure that David Peterson has rounded that corner and is able to be a solid number 3 for an entire season? All of this opens the door for a potential reunion with Jose Quintana, who's still out there in free agency looking for a team. And I say the Mets should give him a call right now. Not tomorrow, not later today, right this second. David Stearns should be getting on the phone with Quintana's agent. The 36-year-old will provide stability for this team. Last year, made 31 starts and had a solid 3.75 ERA. He was tremendous in September, had an ERA below 1 in his final 5 starts of the year, and then had a couple of solid appearances in the playoffs for the team in October. Right now, Spotrac has him valued at $8.3 million for the year. The question is, what is Quintana looking for? There's a reason that he doesn't have a team right now. He's obviously requesting something that other teams are not believing he's worth, whether that's a higher average annual value or maybe a long-term deal. And at 36 years old, I'm sure a lot of teams are hesitant to give him a multi-year deal. Doing business out of desperation, never a good idea, but the Mets are in a corner right now. They're staring down the barrel of having two-fifths of their rotation feature Paul Blackburn, Griffin Canning, or Tyler McGill. So I think the Mets have to bite the bullet here and find a way to bring Quintana back into camp right now. Whether it is a 2-year deal or not, I think they're going to have to go and give him what he needs to get him back, because this rotation, it's paper thin already. The other options for the Mets to re-explore the trade market for Dylan Cease. The Mets were viewed as heavy suitors for the Padres ace, but there's really not been a whole lot of movement on that front. The Padres are going through turmoil with ownership, their previous owner dying, and then having his ex-wife and his direct family claiming ownership of the team. They've made some interesting additions this offseason, not typical of what the Padres used to do, going big game hunting, especially in the international market. But I don't even know if he's available at this point. You know, the rumors have really started to cool off regarding Cease. And AJ Preller, the GM for San Diego, actually even just came out recently and said he's a very big part of our club. So I don't think it's exactly realistic that the Mets can expect to land him, and especially not at a price that I think the Mets would be willing to pay in terms of prospects. Again, negotiating out of desperation. Which brings us to the other injury in camp right now, Nick Madrigal going down. Madrigal was signed this offseason, and most Mets fans believed it was the end of the OMG era with Jose Iglesias, as he would assume the utility role in the middle infield and at third base. Well, Madrigal yesterday on a throw injured his shoulder. It was originally a dislocated shoulder. Now today, Anthony DeComo has reported that it is a fractured shoulder and that he will miss significant time. Carlos Mendoza going on to say he's going to miss, quote, a long time. This, of course, opens the door for the Mets to bring Jose Iglesias back. Iglesias hit .337 over 270 at-bats last year. He hit 4 homers with 6 RBIs, and if you can believe it, had a 3.7 WAR. But probably more important, the rallying cry of OMG. And I have been torn on whether the Mets should bring Jose Iglesias back. Now it seems like a no-brainer with Madrigal going down for what they're calling a significant amount of time. Look, Mets fans shouldn't expect Iglesias to return and hit .330 again this year, but I think David Stern's comment about bringing in Madrigal because he provided more defensive versatility was just a total farce. If you look at this team as it's constructed right now, the Mets don't have a backup shortstop. The team's probably planning on having Luis Acuna and having Ronnie Mauricio try out for the team. One or the two would probably make it. I don't think both of them. But as it stands right now, Acuna would probably be your next practical option at shortstop if anything should happen to Francisco Lindor. Iglesias, probably like Quintana, is seeking a multi-year deal, and I don't think the Mets want to give it to either of them, which is why they're probably still out there in free agency. But just like with Quintana, the Mets may have to bite the bullet and bring him in. I will say this, it's like a movie, right? You see sequels of your favorite movie, it never lives up to the original. A few off the top of my head, Anchorman, the Hangover movies, it just never is as good. And I'm not expecting Jose Iglesias to come back and hit .330 for this team again, but he provides defensive versatility at 3 different infield positions. And guess what? The vibes, they're immaculate with him. And I want to see OMG Part 2, even if it's not as good as the original. So what do you guys think? With Sean Manaea sidelined here at least for a few weeks and potentially longer, do the Mets need to bring Jose Quintana back? And with Nick Madrigal down, do you want the team to re-sign Mr. OMG Jose Iglesias? Be sure to leave a comment in the section below. I want to hear from you guys. 31 days from opening day. Here we go. Let's go Mets.